1916. While the world watched the horrors of Verdun and the Somme, another forgotten front festered in the rugged mountains of the Balkans. Here, a vast multinational Allied army, French, British, Serbian, Russian, Italian, was trapped, facing an enemy dug deep into seemingly impenetrable peaks, the Bulgarians and their German allies. As autumn turned to winter, the Central Powers waited for the freezing cold and blinding snow to halt any Allied action. They believed their mountain fortress was secure. But the Allies, particularly the reborn Serbian army seeking revenge for their homeland, were about to launch a desperate offensive into the teeth of the mountains and the blizzard. This is the story of the Battle of the Monastir Gap, a brutal, high-altitude struggle on the forgotten Salonika front. If you're ready for a tale of incredible endurance, multinational armies, and savage mountain warfare, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into military history. What do you think was the toughest fighting terrain in World War I? Let us know in the comments below. Now, to the frozen peaks of Macedonia. Autumn 1916. The Macedonian Front, also known as the Salonika Front. It was the forgotten front of the Great War, a sprawling, complex, and often static theater of operations winding through the rugged mountains of the southern Balkans. Here, a vast and unwieldy coalition of Allied powers, primarily French, British, Serbian, Russian, and Italian troops, collectively known as the Armée d'Orient, faced off against the armies of the Central Powers, predominantly Bulgaria, supported by significant German and Austro-Hungarian contingents. The front had been established in late 1915, ostensibly to support Serbia against the combined invasion by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. But the Allied intervention came too late. The Serbian army, after a heroic defense, was overwhelmed and forced into a nightmarish winter retreat through the Albanian mountains, eventually being evacuated by Allied ships to the Greek island of Corfu. The Allied forces that had landed at the neutral Greek port of Salonika, modern Thessaloniki, found themselves in a strategic quandary. Too weak to launch a decisive offensive, yet too politically valuable to withdraw. They established a vast fortified camp around the city, often derisively referred to by its own troops as the birdcage. For much of 1916, the front remained relatively static, a line of trenches and fortifications stretching across the mountains from the Adriatic Sea to the Struma River. Life for the soldiers was miserable, plagued by malaria in the swampy valleys during summer and by brutal cold, snow, and ice in the mountains during winter. The strategic purpose of the front was debated constantly in Allied capitals. Was it merely tying down enemy troops? Could it become a springboard for a future offensive to knock Bulgaria out of the war and open a back door into Austria-Hungary? The commander of the Armée d'Orient, the French general Maurice Sarrail, was ambitious and politically connected, constantly lobbying for reinforcements and permission to launch a major attack. Opposing the Allies was a formidable defensive line established primarily by the Bulgarian army, arguably the toughest and most motivated fighting force among Germany's allies on this front. The Bulgarians were fighting on what they considered their own soil or rightfully claimed territory in Macedonia. They were expert mountain soldiers, naturally resilient, and commanded by capable officers. Their positions were dug deep into the rocky slopes of the formidable mountain ranges that dominated the region, the Nice, Baba, and Voras mountains. These were not simple trenches, but intricate networks of stone sangars, machine gun nests blasted from rock, and artillery positions perfectly sited to command the few passes and valleys that offered routes of advance. The Bulgarian defenses were heavily supported by German expertise, engineers, and crucially, heavy artillery. German units, including the elite Alpine Corps in some sectors, often provided the backbone for critical points in the line. The Central Powers commanders, primarily the German General Otto von Below overseeing the army group, were confident. They believed their mountain fortress was impregnable, especially with the onset of the harsh Balkan winter. However, the strategic situation demanded action from the Allies. The ongoing bloodbaths at Verdun and the Somme on the Western Front necessitated efforts to relieve pressure by tying down German reserves. Romania's recent entry into the war on the Allied side also created an opportunity. A successful offensive in Macedonia could potentially link up with Romanian forces and put significant pressure on Austria-Hungary. Furthermore, there was a powerful emotional and political driver, the presence of the reconstituted Serbian army. After their epic and tragic retreat, the Serbian soldiers had been re-equipped and retrained on Corfu. Now, numbering around 125,000 hardened veterans, they burned with a fierce desire for revenge and the liberation of their homeland. Their morale was sky high, and their fighting prowess in mountain terrain was legendary. They formed the sharpest spearhead of the Allied force, positioned strategically in the western sector of the front, directly facing the mountains that barred the way to the occupied Serbian city of Monastir, modern Bitola. General Sarail devised a plan for a major autumn offensive with the primary objective of capturing Monastir. This city held significant symbolic value as a major center in occupied Serbia, and its capture would be a major blow to Bulgarian morale and prestige. The plan involved a multi-pronged attack. The main thrust would be delivered by the Serbian 1st and 2nd Armies, supported by French divisions, directly northwards through the most difficult mountain terrain towards Monastir. To support this main effort, the British Salonika Army would launch diversionary attacks further east in the Struma Valley, aiming to pin down Bulgarian reserves. Italian forces would push northwards from Albania on the far western flank. It was an ambitious plan, relying on coordinating disparate national contingents across a vast, rugged front in increasingly worsening weather conditions. The key to the entire operation lay in breaking through the formidable Bulgarian defenses in the mountains south and east of Monastir. This sector was anchored by a series of towering snow-capped peaks. The most critical of these was Kaymakchalan, a massif rising over 8,000 feet, which dominated the landscape and formed the linchpin of the Bulgarian line. Its capture was assigned to the Serbian Drina Division, part of the 3rd Army acting in support of the main push. The Bulgarians considered Kaymakchalan impregnable. Its slopes were steep, rocky, and swept by machine gun and artillery fire from perfectly concealed positions. They had nicknamed it Boris Grad, the city of Boris, after their czar, believing it could never fall. The battle for Kaymakchalan would become one of the most brutal and epic struggles of the entire Macedonian campaign. The Allied offensive began on September 12, 1916, with a massive artillery bombardment. Unlike Brusilov's precisely targeted storm of fire earlier that year, this was a more conventional, prolonged barrage, aiming to pulverize the enemy defenses through sheer weight of metal. Thousands of French, Serbian, and British guns opened fire, shaking the mountains to their foundations. While the bombardment inflicted significant damage and casualties, the deep Bulgarian dugouts and rock-hewn positions provided considerable protection. When the infantry assaults began, they were met with ferocious resistance. The initial attacks focused on securing the formidable ridges flanking the main approach to Monastir. French Zouaves and colonial troops fought alongside Serbian divisions, clawing their way up steep, barren slopes under a hail of machine gun fire and cascading grenades. Progress was slow, measured in yards, and paid for in rivers of blood. The battle for Kaymakchalan began in earnest. For nearly 3 weeks, from September 12th to September 30th, the Serbian Drina division hurled itself against the mountain fortress. The fighting was relentless, taking place in atrocious weather conditions: freezing rain, fog, and eventually deep snow. The Serbians attacked with a fanatical courage born of desperation and patriotism. They charged up slopes raked by machine guns, engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat in captured trenches, and endured constant Bulgarian counterattacks. The artillery from both sides pounded the peak relentlessly, turning the mountaintop into a shattered moonscape of rock splinters and shell craters. Control of the summit, marked by the small chapel of St. Elijah, changed hands multiple times in savage bayonet charges. The Bulgarians fought with equal tenacity, their elite mountain troops refusing to yield their Boris Grad. Casualties on both sides were horrific. Entire battalions were effectively wiped out. The slopes of Kaymakchalan became known as the Mountain of Death. Finally, on September 30th, after a final desperate assault in a blinding snowstorm, the Serbians secured the summit. They had taken the impregnable fortress, but the cost was staggering. The Drina division alone suffered nearly 4,000 casualties. The capture of Kaymakchalan, however, was the key that unlocked the door. It unhinged the main Bulgarian defensive line and forced them into a fighting withdrawal. With the main defensive line breached, the Allied offensive gained momentum, despite the worsening weather and the logistical nightmare of supplying troops in the mountains. The focus now shifted to the Kurna River, also known as the Cerna Bend or Loop, the last major natural obstacle before Monastir. Here, the Bulgarians, reinforced by German units, rushed to the front, established a new defensive line. What followed was another brutal, month-long battle fought in appalling conditions. French, Serbian, and now Russian troops, 2 brigades having arrived from Archangel, launched repeated attacks across the freezing river and against the fortified heights on the northern bank. The fighting was characterized by costly frontal assaults, savage counterattacks, and constant artillery duels. The weather became a major enemy. Torrential autumn rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Soldiers lived and fought in trenches filled with icy water. Frostbite and trench foot claimed thousands of casualties. The logistical challenges were immense, with mule trains struggling to bring up ammunition and food over trails that were dissolving into mud. Yet slowly, painstakingly, the Allies pushed the Bulgarians and Germans back. Key heights were captured in desperate bayonet charges. By early November, the Allied forces had secured bridgeheads across the Krarine and were finally closing in on Monastir. The Central Powers, facing encirclement and unable to hold the river line indefinitely, began to prepare for a withdrawal from the city. Winter had arrived, but it had not stopped the Allied mountain offensive. The capture of Kaymakchalan, while a significant tactical victory, did not immediately open the road to Monastir. The Bulgarians and their German allies executed a skillful fighting withdrawal, falling back to their next major defensive line along the Kurna River. This river, looping southward in a pronounced bend east of Monastir, formed a formidable natural obstacle. Its northern banks rose steeply into a series of rugged hills and mountains, Chuk Heights, Hill 1050, Snegovo Peak, which the Bulgarians had fortified with characteristic thoroughness. Deep trenches, protected by thick belts of barbed wire, snaked along the crests. Machine gun nests were dug into rock faces, providing plunging fire onto the river crossings and the exposed southern bank. Artillery batteries were concealed in ravines and on reverse slopes, perfectly registered on all potential Allied approach routes. This was the final barrier before Monastir, and the Central Powers were determined to hold it. The task of breaking this line fell primarily to the Serbian 1st and 2nd Armies, supported by French and Russian divisions. The Serbs, despite their heavy losses at Kaymakchalan, were driven by an almost superhuman determination. Monastir was not just a strategic objective, it was Serbian soil, a piece of their homeland occupied by the hated Bulgarians. Every soldier knew they were fighting to liberate their own country. This profound motivation gave them a resilience that astonished their French and British allies. They were fighting with the ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle for the Kurna Bend began in early October and would rage for nearly 2 months, becoming one of the most savage and sustained engagements on the Macedonian front. The initial Allied attacks focused on securing bridgeheads across the river. Under the cover of often inadequate artillery fire, Serbian and French infantry would attempt to cross the icy, fast-flowing water on flimsy pontoon bridges or by wading, often under intense machine gun and shrapnel fire. Casualties were heavy from the start. Men were swept away by the current or cut down in the water. Those who made it to the northern bank faced an immediate, near-vertical climb up slopes, laced with barbed wire and swept by machine gun fire from the heights above. The fighting quickly devolved into a series of brutal small-unit actions. Squads and platoons would attempt to crawl up gullies, seeking cover behind rocks, trying to find a weak point in the Bulgarian line. Progress was measured in yards, often lost again in fierce Bulgarian counterattacks. The conditions were appalling, arguably worse than those on the Western Front at the time. October brought torrential autumn rains, turning the river valleys into seas of mud and the mountain slopes into treacherous, slippery death traps. Soldiers lived for weeks in waterlogged trenches, often knee-deep in freezing mud. Shelter was minimal. The rocky ground made digging deep dugouts difficult. Exposure became as deadly an enemy as the Bulgarians. Trenchfoot, frostbite, pneumonia, and dysentery ravaged the Allied ranks. Evacuating the wounded was a nightmare. Stretcher-bearers struggled for hours to carry injured men down precipitous, shell-swept mountain paths to the nearest aid station, often located miles to the rear. Many wounded died of exposure before they could receive medical attention. The logistical chain, relying almost entirely on pack mules struggling along barely existent mountain trails, was stretched to the breaking point. Ammunition was constantly in short supply. Rations were meager. For the soldiers fighting in the Kurna Bend, it was a war against the terrain, the weather, and a determined enemy all at once. Despite these horrific conditions, the Allies pressed their attacks relentlessly. The Serbs, in particular, fought with a savage determination. The battle centered on a series of numbered heights that dominated the Kurnay Loop. Hill 1050 became infamous, changing hands multiple times in ferocious bayonet charges and countercharges. The fighting here was primitive and brutal. Soldiers used grenades, trench knives, and sharpened shovels in desperate struggles for control of shattered trench lines and rock sangers. Artillery from both sides pounded the contested peaks continuously, showering the defenders with rock splinters and high explosives. The constant shelling stripped the hills bare, leaving a landscape of pulverized rock and twisted metal, haunted by the dead and wounded of both sides. Supporting the Serbian infantry were French divisions, including units of Zouaves and tirailleurs, experienced colonial troops accustomed to hard fighting. 2 brigades of the Russian Expeditionary Force, sent to Salonika as a symbol of Tsarist commitment to the Allied cause, were also thrown into the fray. These Russian soldiers, far from home and fighting in unfamiliar terrain, nonetheless distinguished themselves with their stoicism and bravery, particularly in repelling Bulgarian counterattacks. The Battle of the Kurna Bend was a truly multinational effort, a testament to the strange coalition that had assembled on this forgotten front. Italians pushed on the far left flank. British attacks pinned down Bulgarian reserves on the Struma front to the east, while Serbs, French, and Russians bled together in the mountains before Monastir. The Bulgarian defense, stiffened by German machine gun units and artillery support, was incredibly tenacious. They utilized the terrain with masterful skill, their machine guns sighted for maximum effect, their counterattacks swift and brutal. They knew that losing the Kurna line meant losing Monastir, and they fought with the desperation of men defending vital ground. However, the relentless Allied pressure, particularly the fanatical determination of the Serbs, began to wear them down. The constant artillery fire, though often hampered by ammunition shortages, took a heavy toll. The continuous infantry assaults, despite their horrific cost to the Allies, gradually gained ground, capturing key observation points and threatening the stability of the entire Bulgarian line. Leto Vorbek's strategy of tying down disproportionate Allied resources was mirrored here, but in reverse. The Allies were willing to expend disproportionate numbers of men to achieve their objective, fueled by the Serbs' burning desire to liberate Monastir. By early November, after weeks of relentless grinding combat, the Allied forces had secured several key heights overlooking the Krna Bend. The Bulgarian positions, though still formidable, were becoming increasingly untenable. Their casualties had been severe, and their morale was beginning to crack under the ceaseless pressure. The German command, recognizing that the line could not be held indefinitely without massive reinforcements, which were unavailable due to commitments on other fronts, authorized a gradual withdrawal. The final Allied push began in mid-November. French and Serbian troops launched coordinated assaults, finally breaking through the last Bulgarian defenses around the villages of Polog and Ivan. The fighting remained fierce to the last, with Bulgarian machine gun crews often fighting until they were killed at their posts. But the momentum was now entirely with the Allies. The road to Monastir was finally open. Recognizing that the city itself could not be held without risking the encirclement of their remaining forces, the German and Bulgarian command made the painful decision to evacuate Monastir. On November 19, 1916, French cavalry patrols cautiously entered the city, followed closely by Serbian infantry. The moment was one of immense emotional significance for the Serbs. After a year of exile and unimaginable suffering, they had liberated the first major city of their occupied homeland. The civilian population greeted them as heroes, pouring into the streets despite the danger of retreating enemy shellfire. General Sarail made a triumphant entry into the city, claiming a major victory for the Armée d'Orient. The Monastir offensive was officially over. The victory, however, was bittersweet and strategically limited. Monastir had been captured, but the cost had been enormous. The Allies had suffered over 50,000 casualties, French, Serbian, Russian, Italian, and British, in the brutal 3-month campaign. The Central Powers' losses were also heavy, estimated at over 60,000, including thousands taken prisoner. But their front had not completely collapsed. The Bulgarians and Germans simply withdrew a few miles north to a new defensive line in the mountains overlooking Monastir. The city itself remained within range of enemy artillery and would continue to be shelled for the next 2 years. The hoped-for strategic breakthrough, the link-up with Romania, which was itself collapsing under a German counter-invasion, had not materialized. The Macedonian front settled back into a state of semi-static warfare, the birdcage simply having been moved slightly further north. The capture of Monastir on November 19, 1916, was hailed in Paris and London as a major Allied victory, a much-needed success story after the grinding attrition of the Somme and Verdun. Newspapers trumpeted the liberation of the Serbian city and the defeat of the Bulgarians. General Sarail received accolades. But for the soldiers who had actually fought the battle, the sense of triumph was muted, overshadowed by the immense cost and the grim reality that the war on the Macedonian front was far from over. The offensive had succeeded in pushing the front line forward by an average of 30 miles and liberating a key city, but it had failed in its larger strategic aims. It had not knocked Bulgaria out of the war, nor had it decisively broken the Central Powers' hold on the Balkans. The German and Bulgarian forces, though badly mauled, had conducted a skillful withdrawal to yet another formidable mountain line just north of Monastir, where they would remain entrenched for almost 2 more years. The human cost of the Monastir offensive was staggering, particularly for the Serbian army. Having already suffered unimaginable losses during the 1915 invasion and subsequent retreat through Albania, the reconstituted Serbian army threw itself into the battle for Monastir with almost suicidal ferocity. They paid the price. Serbian casualties in the offensive numbered around 30,000 men killed and wounded. While they achieved their goal of liberating Monastir, the offensive consumed a huge portion of their remaining manpower, leaving the army significantly weakened for future operations. The French also suffered heavily, losing upwards of 15,000 men. The Russian brigades lost several thousand. British and Italian casualties involved in supporting or flanking operations added to the grim total. The Central Powers' losses were even higher, with estimates exceeding 60,000 Bulgarian, German, and Ottoman troops killed, wounded, or captured, though figures vary widely. The offensive had been a bloodbath, a typically attritional WW1 battle fought in some of the most difficult terrain imaginable. One of the most significant consequences of the Monastir offensive was its impact on the internal dynamics of the Central Powers in the Balkans. The catastrophic failure of the Austro-Hungarian army during the Brusilov offensive earlier in the year had already forced Germany to take effective command of the Eastern Front. The near collapse of the Bulgarian army during the Monastir campaign completed this process on the Macedonian front. While Bulgarian soldiers remained the bulk of the fighting force, the strategic direction, logistical support, and crucially, the provision of elite reserve units increasingly fell under German control. German officers took key command positions, and German military doctrine became paramount. This Germanization of the front, while improving its military efficiency, also bred resentment among the Bulgarian troops and leadership, contributing to the eventual Bulgarian collapse in 1918. The offensive had exposed the fragility of the Central Powers coalition in the Balkans. For the Allies, the capture of Monastir provided a significant morale boost and a tangible success to justify the existence of the often criticized Salonika front. It proved that the multinational Armée d'Orient could launch a successful offensive against formidable mountain defenses. It also secured a forward base that would be crucial for the final decisive Allied offensive in 1918. However, the immense difficulty and cost of the campaign tempered any illusions about a quick victory in the Balkans. The terrain was simply too difficult, the enemy too tenacious, and the logistical challenges too immense for the kind of sweeping breakthroughs seen elsewhere. The Monastir offensive demonstrated that the Macedonian front would be won not by brilliant maneuvers, but by a slow, grinding process of attrition, mountain by mountain, ridge by ridge. The battle also highlighted the unique challenges of coalition warfare. General Sarail, while achieving his objective, faced constant difficulties coordinating the actions of the disparate national contingents under his command. Each army had its own command structure, its own logistical systems, its own national priorities, and often deep-seated historical rivalries. The Serbs were focused solely on liberating their homeland. The French saw the front as strategically vital for flanking the Central Powers. The British remained skeptical, viewing it as a costly sideshow diverting resources from the Western Front. The Italians were primarily concerned with their own interests in Albania. The Russians were present more for political symbolism than strategic weight. Welding these competing interests into a cohesive fighting force was a constant struggle for Sarail. That the offensive succeeded at all was a testament as much to the shared determination to defeat the enemy as it was to Sarail's often criticized leadership. The brutal nature of the fighting in the mountains left a deep scar on the soldiers who endured it. Veterans of the Macedonian front spoke of a different kind of war. One fought not just against bullets and shells, but against rock, ice, mud, and disease. Malaria was endemic in the lowlands, while frostbite and exposure were constant threats in the highlands. The landscape itself was an enemy. Advances often involved scaling near vertical cliffs under fire. Retreat meant scrambling down treacherous slopes while being shelled. Supply lines were fragile threads winding through hostile terrain. It was a war of endurance, where simply surviving the elements was a daily battle. The soldiers who fought at Kaymakchalan and the Kurna Bend endured some of the most extreme conditions faced by any troops in the First World War. Their resilience was extraordinary. The Monastir offensive, though costly and strategically limited in the short term, played a vital role in the long arc of the First World War. It kept significant numbers of German and Bulgarian troops tied down in the Balkans, preventing them from reinforcing other, more critical fronts. It provided a crucial morale boost to the Allies, particularly the Serbs, demonstrating that the Central Powers were not invincible. It severely weakened the Bulgarian army, contributing to its eventual collapse 2 years later. And perhaps most importantly, it established the forward positions from which the final, decisive Allied offensive under General Franchet d'Espèrey would be launched in September 1918. That offensive, spearheaded once again by the revitalized Serbian army, would shatter the Bulgarian front, leading to Bulgaria's rapid exit from the war and triggering the final collapse of the Central Powers. The road to that ultimate victory began in the bloody mountain passes south of Monastir. In the end, the Central Powers had waited for winter to stop the Allies. They had trusted in the impregnability of their mountain fortress, believing the combination of terrain, fortifications, and the brutal Balkan weather would halt any offensive. But they had failed to account for the sheer determination of the Allied soldiers, particularly the Serbs, who were driven by a force more powerful than any blizzard: the desperate longing to reclaim their homeland. The mountain offensive succeeded against all odds through unimaginable sacrifice and endurance. It was a brutal, grinding slog, a battle fought inch by bloody inch up slopes of rock and ice. The capture of Monastir was not the end of the war on the Salonika front, but it was a critical turning point, a testament to the fact that even the strongest walls, whether made of concrete or mountains, can eventually be broken by the unyielding pressure of human will. The forgotten front had roared to life, and its echoes would contribute to the final silencing of the guns across Europe.